The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So we are here today on Titans of Nuclear with George Verberg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it will be a pleasure, I hope, and expect.
So you're the former vice chairman of the board of Urenco and also lead probably the most prominent pro-nuclear energy group in the Netherlands right now. But before we get to current events, I'd love to just learn a little bit about your past and where you grew up and how you got started into the sector.
Well, I was born in Jakarta, Indonesia, and then I moved, of course, my parents moved, and I went with them to the Netherlands. I studied.
Were your parents diplomats or engineers, or how did they get out there?
No, my father was a tobacco planter.
Okay.
Well, so we moved to the Netherlands, and after high school, I went to the Erasmus University, Rotterdam, where I studied macroeconomics.
Great.
Thereafter, I got a fellowship from the Ford Foundation to spend 1 year for a specific task, doing research at MIT and at Berkeley, both at the president's offices of those two well-known universities. Thereafter, I went to the Ministry of Education and Science in the Netherlands for 3 years. And in 1974, I moved to the Ministry of Economic Affairs to be one of the 3 civil servants who had to write and prepare the white paper, which at that time Minister of Economic Affairs, Ruud Lubbers, who later became a long-time Prime Minister of the Netherlands, as a result of the first oil crisis in 1973, 1974.
And before we continue, was it an interest in economics or an interest in government that was driving your career decisions?
It was both, because my economics knowledge assisted me in designing policy advices for the ministers which I have served. And that was a very fun combination for me. And therefore, I have spent about 17 years in government. In the government.
And is there a specific type of economic model that you've followed or that believe is the best path to lead government? Do you fall into a specific camp, or has that changed over the course of your career as you've taken in new information and seen how the world works?
Well, my career has developed always at least for me, in a surprising way. When I started my study of economics, I thought I will become a real economist, even with a PhD, but I never succeeded in that because I never tried really. But my economics was, let's say, influenced by the works of, let's say, Robert Solow and other great economists at that time working in MIT and other places.
Yes, it's okay. Please continue with your journey.
Well, in economic affairs, Ministry of Economic Affairs, I was very busy with this, assisting in writing the white paper on energy policy. It was the first energy policy white paper since decades. And it was a very interesting thing to do because, as you might imagine, it had to do with all kinds of energy sources which you could imagine, whether it was coal or oil or gas, or even at that time we started with wind and nuclear. They all came together in a mix which was considered to be important for the energy mix of the Netherlands.
And this theory about having diverse energy sources, it makes sense to me at the front, but aren't some energy sources better than others? I mean, is every energy source really equal? Do you really always want to mix, or do you want to at some point move towards a select 2 or 3 energy sources?
Well, in practice, it was focused upon 3 energy sources for a long time in the Netherlands: gas, coal, or oil, and nuclear. But nuclear never developed very much after the first one of about 500 megawatt in Borselen.
And why is
Zealand.
that? Why just one plant and that was it?
Well, it was because nuclear, when the Minister Lubbers proposed to Parliament to expand nuclear power plants with 3,000 megawatt, which was quite considerable at the time of, we are talking about 1974. Soon thereafter, it became clear that there were some serious doubts whether that was the best way forward, in particular in, let's say, the more or less left of the center political arena.
And what was their specific criticism?
Well, we are talking about the years 1970. So you had the issues of nuclear waste, radioactive waste. You had the issue of non-proliferation. At that time, there was not yet EIAA with the responsibilities as they have now. There was one was not certain whether the nuclear reactors which would have been built in the 70s would have been as safe as you would like to have. And all these that mix of thoughts and second thoughts about nuclear was coming together and has led us to a delay of executing this policy decision of 3,000 megawatt. So first, the issue was to try to solve all the issues which were tabled by the opponents of nuclear power. And so we did. We put a lot of attention to the issue mentioned and tabled, but I have to be honest that a part of the opponent have never been convinced or were willing to be convinced, or whatever it might have been. And that's their judgment to decide how they want to have it cleared.
I'm wondering if, reflecting on that, I mean, so I came into this industry just a few years ago, but one thing that I've seen in studying the history of this industry is the more that nuclear advocates try to convince people that don't want nuclear, let's say the waste or whatever the issue is, the more we try, they never change their mind, but we keep agreeing to things that just make it more expensive and more difficult to build nuclear. And then they've got a new argument, which is it's too expensive and it takes too long. Have you found that throughout your career as well?
Well, partly yes, but you also could see the sunny side of it. That is that the nowadays generation of nuclear power plants to be built is really safe to exploit. And that's to a certain extent, of course, a result of the research which was done after all the doubts were tabled by the opponents. And again, there are many opponents of nuclear who will never be convinced by the progress which we have made in the nuclear domain. So be it. But nevertheless, in nowadays world with the climate crisis ahead of us and closing in on a time schedule which is really ambitious in order to prevent larger damage, then you can come into a situation where you evaluate the remaining risks of nuclear, which are almost not visible, but always you can argue that it is still there because it's man-made, against the remaining risks of everything we do in order to stop the coming climate crisis. Yeah. And if you have the guts to be rational, then I'm pretty sure that many opponents will say, well, we do not like it, and if we could have avoided, the better, but if need be, then we need also use the nuclear power plants in our energy mix in order to stop the warming of the Earth.
That's a very optimistic outlook. Sometimes
you always
I feel
have
like
to be optimistic.
Yeah, I am too. But sometimes I feel the people who don't like nuclear don't even care about climate either. Otherwise, they'd already find themselves nuclear advocates. But but we can come back to that later. Please. So the 3,000 megawatts were tabled. And then what happened? I know at some point you became the Director General at the Directorate for Energy at the Ministry of Economic Affairs.
Yes, that was
about that position.
Yes, that was in 1981, and in 1980 we have had a very broad discussion in society with thousands of participants in the discussions. Spent some 40-50 million guilders at the time, which was quite a chunk of money in order to organize that broad discussion. And the conclusion of that broad discussion was that it was not the first thing to do to build new nuclear in the Netherlands. Of course, you have to realize that we have in the Netherlands a huge gas abundance at that in that era, and therefore it was easy to walk away from something difficult and to use natural gas because that was very easy to use. It was safe to use. It was giving the government a lot of money due to the government take of the natural gas production. And it was geopolitical very safe because it was our own gas, yes, and not gas from someone else.
I always say that if it weren't for climate change, gas is a great energy source. You know, you can, if you're a high technology society, you can dig deep enough, you'll find gas.
I agree. Yeah, yeah, but that has turned sour in the Netherlands due to the earthquakes, earth tremors in the soil above the Groningen Reservoir.
Mm. And
okay, in the after this broad discussion in society, and after the advice, which was not a no to nuclear, but not now, one of my first tasks as Director General of Energy was to design and formulate with my staff what kind of point of view will the government take on the outcome of this broad societal discussion. And that government point of view was that we should build between 2 and 4 nuclear reactors of 1,000 megawatt each.
And what year is this?
Then we are talking about something like 1984.
Okay.
And so we went out to inform the public about this point of view of the government. We went out with our staff and experts from the geological service of the state and so on and so forth, to explain what would be the consequences of building nuclear power plants in the Netherlands. We focused initially on about 7 locations where it could be built. At first sight, when we went into it in more depth, it came out that 3 locations would be the best, with a lot of cooling water nearby, a lot of industrial area space, and that has been more or less sealed in the space planning projects. We also went out with the electricity sector and industry to find which nuclear power plants would be most interesting for the Netherlands. So we went to Sweden, which at that time had ASEA as a company building nuclear power plants. We went to Germany, we went to France, and we went to Canada, which had a complete different type, the CANDU reactor, which was nevertheless very interesting concept. And in Canada, they showed us that they indeed were working pretty well. They are still working pretty well, if I'm well informed. So that was good to know. Before the final decision would have taken place in the Parliament, in the second chamber of Parliament, about the locations and whatever was still to be decided. Even the date of the vote in Parliament was already set in 86, and mentioning the name, then you already can imagine what happened. About 3 or 4 days before the vote in Parliament would have taken place, Chernobyl happened.
Bad timing.
And that was, always, that was, of course, an event which was so important and disastrous for our plans at that time, that we had to put it in the fridge in order to wait for a time where we have completely studied at why, at where, and could it happen again, and so on and so forth with Chernobyl.
And how, so, you know, I go around the world collecting different perspectives on the reaction to this event. I'm wondering, how long did it take for at least the nuclear community, the scientific community in your region, to say a lot of what happened was a function of it being an RBMK, and with the graphite tips and all of these different things that are very unique to this reactor? And I'm assuming you weren't considering RBMK designs, you were considering water-based designs. How long did it take, at least for your local scientific community, to decide this shouldn't impact our plans to move forward? Convincing the public's another thing, but how long did it take internally to say, yes, we want to keep doing this?
I'm not aware. I do not know how long it would have taken them. I would guess some 2-3 years. A lot has been cleared by the conferences of the IAEA in order to find out what happened and to learn from what happened. But I cannot tag a certain year on it when the Nuclear Society was ready with evaluating the events and drawing its conclusions. But apart from that, it was much more important that the society was not at all ready to think again about expanding nuclear. So we had to wait and see what would happen.
And
But then,
I am wondering, how come, and this is maybe a question nobody can answer, but I'll ask it anyway. How come the nuclear industry itself doesn't go through like a giant marketing campaign at this moment to explain that not all nuclear power plants are the same? Just like if there was a giant chemical explosion, Bhopal, for instance, you know, the chemical industry says, listen, this isn't the same everywhere. We're not going to stop building chemical plants. Or when a hydro dam collapses, they say it's not the same. We're not going to stop building hydro dams. How come the nuclear industry didn't come out in force? You know, it's 10% of the world's energy. That's a lot of money in the industry. How come they didn't come out in force and say, it's not the same, we're not going to stop building nuclear plants?
I think that would have not made sense, at least not in the Netherlands or in, let's say, Western Europe, apart from France, where it was not necessary because they were already convinced that nuclear is a very valuable part of the energy mix. But the anti-nuclear groups were very capable of having their own marketing activities,
That makes sense.
and with fueling fear for something which you cannot see, cannot taste, cannot smell. It is a job very difficult to counter. We also have seen after Chernobyl that some of the anti-nuclear groups were talking in terms of hundreds, thousands of deaths. A lot of people have, a lot of women have decided to get an abortion due to all this unclear situation, which was really used by the opponents to fuel the uneasy feeling, to say the least, about nuclear. So I think it was wise not to spend a lot of money into pro-nuclear branding campaign, because in my opinion that would not have helped, which is as we saw it in the Netherlands, no money was spent on it. And one of my last advices as Director General of Energy to that time Minister of Economic Affairs was to make it officially known that the plans for nuclear expansion were put in the fridge.
And how did that make you feel at the time?
Well, you have, let's say, a month of frustration, and thereafter you try to make the best of what is needed. I'm not, at least I believe I'm not a person who can be frustrated for long, because there is so much to do, so many exciting other challenges, that the way forward is best to do without frustration.
Yeah, that's a pretty good stoic attitude. Moving on then, in your career, you ended up joining Urenco. What precipitated that?
Well, I was, that was only in 2003, 2004, that I joined the board of Urenco, which is a one-tier board construction like in many Anglo-Saxon companies. It's based in the UK, the headquarters of Urenco. But my main job after my time as Director General of Energy was to be part of the board of Gasunie. So that was quite a change, because for the first time since long, I only had to do with one type of energy source, that is natural gas. And I had no responsibilities whatsoever for coal, oil, or nuclear or wind. But nevertheless, also that was an exciting time.
Yes, yes. So, but tell me, yeah, that was a long time ago. How have things changed over these last 20 years?
In the nuclear domain, of course.
In the nuclear domain, but just we still want to just hear about you and your perspective of energy and how you've seen society shift. Just hear your thoughts.
Okay, at the start of my career in economic affairs with energy, and later on certainly with Gasunie, I had the same idea like you mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that natural gas is a wonderful source of energy. However, later, and I think that I turned my views on the issue of carbon dioxide around 2001, 2002. So for many, real climate change was much too late, but nevertheless.
Hey, that's early for a lot of people. A lot of people take a lot longer than that, I'll tell you.
Well, I know also many who think I was pretty late. So in 2002, I was already designated to become a president of the NGO International Gas Union, which is the worldwide natural gas and gas NGO. And I would become president of the IGU for the triennium 2003-2006. And in those years of preparing the 2003 start, I had to work, which was a lot gave me a lot of inspiration and fun with our Japanese colleagues at the time, who were the presidents of 2003. We already started to speak about natural gas as the fuel for the intermission, for the transition period towards a carbon dioxide free world. And in the Dutch triennium, we have spent a lot of attention to this issue of transition, natural gas as a transition fuel. So that was completely different, talking about natural gas as we did in, let's say, the 80s and the 90s of the last century. And that has been, at least in my thinking, developed further and further. So when CCS, carbon capture and storage methods were tabled, I also thought, well, it's perhaps expensive and difficult to do, but we cannot exclude that possibility to abate carbon dioxide emissions further. And since I think around 3-4 years since the Minister of Economic Affairs has decided to close in the Groningen natural gas production and to end all the natural gas production of Groningen, that I have made another turn, that I think that natural gas really should end before 2050. We can make good use of natural gas as a transition fuel, either as a real fuel or as a possibility to make hydrogen, which is necessary to change the production processes of a lot of heavy industry, chemical industry, steel industry. But thereafter, we should not use natural gas anymore. That also has a geopolitical idea behind it, because if we don't have our natural gas ourselves, then we become so dependent from sources where we have to import natural gas from, that
Like Russia.
I feel, for instance, to mention an important supplier.
Sorry, I had to say it just in case.
Yes,
just in case
yes,
someone
yes,
in our
yes.
audience wasn't picking up.
I cannot understand, but you're right. Yes, yes, that's not my first choice nowadays to have imports from.
So you've come to this conclusion that although natural gas is a great transition, and I agree as well, and a great fuel other than climate emissions, it's a shame. And maybe even someday they'll be able to do something where it doesn't emit and they can capture, but we'll see about that. I'm not keeping my finger crossed.
Yeah.
In the meantime, this leaves nuclear. If you need to power an energetic society, and you want dispatchable power, and you want baseload power, and you want it to be clean, and you want it to have the smallest waste footprint and the smallest environmental footprint of any other source, nuclear, right?
Yeah.
But then you began joining advocacy efforts in this space as well. Tell me about that.
Well, due to the events and the developments in the last decade, I suddenly realized that there was a lot of talk, and rightly so, in my opinion, about building windmills on sea, somewhat less about windmills on land, because we are quite a highly populated, densely populated country. Solar panels on roofs, solar panels in meadows, in order to create a lot of energy sources without carbon dioxide emissions. And then I thought, we in the Netherlands have a relatively high energy intensive industry due to our natural gas history, where it was easy to locate huge energy intensive industries like Dow Chemicals in the Netherlands and DSM in the Netherlands and many others. If you want to keep your industry with all the labor places which go around with that, and all the supplier companies for whatever things you might, an energy intensive industry might need of, then we should be think again whether we should stay out of the nuclear development. And then when I had myself reached the point that I thought and think that that is not very wise to do, to stay out of the nuclear, if you realize what a huge task is ahead of us in order to reach Paris 2050 in time, that I found a couple of my, let's say, business friends and told them how I thought about this issue. And I was, of course, pleased that quite a few of them told me, well, you are right, let's do something about it, and let's try to make the politicians and the authorities aware that there is still another source of carbon dioxide free energy source, which is nuclear. So let's try to make nuclear part of the discussion again. And with a small group, and still a small group of around 10 people, we started last year our endeavor to bring nuclear to the fore. Well, at least we see that also our endeavor has added a little bit to the awareness of nuclear as one of the important possibilities to change your present carbon dioxide rich energy mix towards carbon dioxide zero or net zero energy mix. So thereafter, we also asked well-known Dutch people who have been former ministers or important business people, not too many, just enough to have a solid body of people who are wise and know a lot and know how to weigh the different issues which are at stake if you are talking about an energy mix with nuclear or without nuclear. And these people, around 15, were willing to assist us in a very useful way, that they gave their advice, which enables us to stay out of making poor moves which would be counterproductive.
And what would that be, like trying to go against renewables? Is that one of those examples where that seems like it might be counterproductive?
Well, it's funny you are thinking that's the first thing you think about, because from the very, very start, also by myself, there was one very important decision taken, that we would not be against the renewables like wind and solar and what you have more, earth heat or whatever, because the task Paris 2015 is too big to kick out any option which we can make use of, like wind, like solar panels. So that was never at stake, but it could be that perhaps we would have started with arguing that we should start with 20 nuclear power plants. Well, that's not the best way forward in the Netherlands. Let's first see how it develops. And we see so far that the development is going rather well. A lot of people are understanding that the nuclear world also has developed for the better, with better designed nuclear power plants, a very good and solid interim solution for nuclear waste, with giving us all the time needed to prepare for the final decision for the final repository place of nuclear and the way and when. So that made it possible that we have noted quite important change in the opinion of public society vis-à-vis nuclear. And nowadays, I think that if you had just a vote in Parliament on will we expand nuclear or not, I'm not talking about with how much, but just in principle, the first question, that you will get a majority in favor of expanding our nuclear power part in the energy mix.
And what is the vote in Parliament meant to secure? Is it to put money into the development, or is it to create land that's allocated for nuclear? And one more question on that. Why is it even necessary? Is it possible that an independent power producer could come in and just build a nuclear plant like anyone builds any electric infrastructure and then sell to private industry or sell to the grid?
I think that the latter proposition, which you just mentioned, is in principle possible, because there is no law like in Germany which forbid the building and exploitation of nuclear power plants. However, first of all, there are 3 designated locations at the time. So you need to get space in one of these 3 locations. Second, for an important investment like a nuclear power plant, I think that the investor would like to see that there is broad acceptance, let's say a license to operate the business, and because otherwise you do not invest a lot of money in your endeavor in a country which is hostile to nuclear power plants, because that is just taking a risk which is not a real business risk. That could be a risk of a madman, and that's not what an investor is. So it is important that the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the other ministries who are involved and Parliament give at least a notice that they accept nuclear as one of the important or sources in on our way to Paris 2050.
And then just a fine point on something you said. In order to get a little bit of confidence that the government will support this for the investors, does it actually require Parliament, or can it just be the ministry itself and taking meetings with the government and the government saying, yes, if you want to pay for this on your own, we approve?
Again, in principle, there is no law against it. And therefore, I expect that if an investor who wants to build nuclear power plant in the Netherlands, whether it is an EPR or whether it is an SMR, that this investor will go to the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And then the Minister of Economic Affairs will look up in the government agreement about the coming 4 years, whether in this government agreement it is stated that nuclear is acceptable or not. If it's not, then he will say to the investor, at least that's my reading of it, well, there is no law which forbids it to build, but you'll be aware and realize that we are not happy with your investment. So it's your decision, but then at least you know how we look at it.
Yes,
and if in
that
the
would
government
scare away any investor if the government were to say we're not happy with it. I get it.
Yes,
but
yes.
I guess what I'm wondering, is there a middle ground where you don't need an overwhelming support throughout Parliament, but there also isn't a negative signal either?
We do not need an overwhelming support. Besides the question, what is overwhelming? What's the definition of that? You not need a majority okay. In government and a majority in Parliament in order to be convinced that you will get your license to operate from society.
And not to belabor the point, but can't Parliament majorities change? I mean, isn't it possible that you get the approval from Parliament now, but a savvy investor thinking this is a couple $2 billion investment, it's going to take several years, maybe half a decade till it's actually online, thinks that there's a possibility that in those next 5 years, Parliament may change their mind?
We are, and I'm quite happy with that, a very democratic country. So majorities can switch over time and can change over time, depending on your point of view, for the better or for the worse. That's up to the democratic outcome of the voting process.
Should the democratic outcome of the voting process really decide electric infrastructure?
Yes, it is part and parcel of our society.
Yeah.
And it's not a part and parcel of just the business society. It is for all of us important that we at least accept that the license to operate is being given also to the nuclear sector. And there is a good chance, in my opinion, that this license to operate will be there when it is needed. Why do I say when it is needed? As long as no investors has come to the fore to say, we have read and we have learned that some change has been noticed in the Netherlands in favor of nuclear, and now we would like to consider seriously the possibilities of an investment in the Netherlands, then you need from the Minister of Economic Affairs one way or another way a statement that you are free to go and that you are welcome.
Very good. And then there's one thing I want to mention. There was a comedian, a Dutch comedian, that brought up nuclear maybe a year or two ago. Do you remember
Yes.
that?
Yeah, sure.
How did that happen? It's so odd to me that a comedian out of nowhere would start advocating for nuclear. Do you know the story behind it?
Yes, Mr. Lubach, he is a very interesting comedian, because he quite often picks an item which is one way or another way frozen in society's thoughts. And there are quite a few of these items which he thinks is a little bit crazy or dumb, not to think about it for a second time. So he has also picked once, I believe indeed it was 1.5 or 2 years ago, the issue of nuclear. And he made a big item of that. A lot of laugh went around in Dutch society, but at the same time, many people woke up and said, hey, gosh, we have a thought about nuclear. Let's do that again, and let's take it serious. And after taking it serious, then perhaps we come to the conclusion that nuclear should be part of our energy mix on our way towards 2050 Paris.
Yeah.
And so it happens. It was indeed amazing. And a lot of anti-nuclear people and NGOs, they were furious, because with this light-hearted way of approaching this frozen nuclear issue, suddenly they saw that people were starting thinking again about nuclear, instead of just working the way these anti-nuclear opponents had made ready for them to work.
It's amazing. I wish that model could be replicated around the world. Whatever he did, he did just right.
Yeah. But I'm afraid that Mr. Lubach will not travel around the world for this to do.
Sure, yes. So tell me, what's next? What are the next milestones that we're looking for to see a real, development effort for nuclear in your country?
Well, I don't know whether that will be first in time, but let's say a very important issue is what kind of coalition between different political parties will be established in the coming weeks, months for a new government. In the Netherlands, it could be rather fast, but I'm afraid that this time it will be one of the longer taking forming of government coalitions. But that's important because, as I've tried to explain earlier, if in this government coalition paper it's not stated that nuclear is also welcome as part of the energy mix, one way or another way worded, then of course we cannot advise would-be investors that their license to operate is ready available for them. Second, the Minister of Economic Affairs has asked the KPMG group, accountancy group, to sort out what kind of issues play in the electricity market and in the energy market, which are important for the development of nuclear power in the Netherlands? Are there setbacks? Are there items which are in favor of nuclear? I cannot think at this point in time about anything in favor because it's very much not set that way because there was no nuclear at the horizon. So KPMG has to sort out what hurdles are there in the market, what opportunities are there in the market, what changes could be envisaged in the market in order to create a level playing field between the main sources of energy in climate neutral energy mix. So then you have to think again, of course, about wind, solar, and nuclear as the three main pillars of such an energy mix. And that is a report which we expect at, let's say, at the end of June this year. And that's, of course, a very important feed for thought for both investors as well as for the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the other ministries which are involved. A third item, which is important, that also there will be looked into the willingness of the local societies, provinces, to mention an important layer of government in the Netherlands, whether they accept or do not accept a nuclear power plant in their province. And so, for instance, I have the feeling, the idea that the province of Zeeland, where Borselen is already housed for decades, since 73 or something like that, that they know nuclear, that they know that nuclear is an easy neighbor in your surroundings. So I expect that the province of Zeeland will be in favor of expanding nuclear power in its province. But there could be other provinces which also would like to see nuclear power plants in their province. And the chances for that, I think, have grown thanks to the development of the nuclear sector towards the SMRs, because small modular reactors, it's quite a difference whether you're talking about 1,600 megawatt EPR of EDF, or whether you are talking about, let's say, a 300 megawatt SMR of General Electric Hitachi, just to mention one of the several SMRs which are approaching the point in time where they can really launch on the market. So that's a huge difference, both from a technical point of view, also from the point of view whether it is easy to integrate these nuclear power plants in the existing electricity grid system in the Netherlands, and from the point of view whether the surrounding society is willing to accept it. If you are not used to nuclear, then I would guess that an SMR is easier to adjust yourself to than let's say an EPR of 1,500 megawatt. So yeah. These three items are very important: the coalition agreement, the marketing outcome of KPMG, and the acceptance survey for nuclear in the different parts of the Netherlands.
Excellent. George, as we wrap up here today, do you just want to leave us with a final thought on why this is important?
Well, it is important because if you take the total energy requirements and hydrogen requirements for the industry in particular, in order to reach Paris 2050 in time, then you need such a huge energy source that I can think that I think that wind, sun, and nuclear together, and where necessary also with CCS, as long as you need some natural gas as transition, that mix is necessary, is capable, and is also wise from a geopolitical point of view.
George Verberg, thank you so much for taking the time today. Really appreciate your insight and look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you, Brett, and I hope that I have interested the audience. Thank you.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.